is, of course, the arrival of the Gerald W. McNeely collection of Pewabic pottery here at Cranbrook. This is a project that I and a few of my colleagues were working on for about the past 4 years. And it really came to a culmination with the exhibition that you see in the deSalle Gallery that opened in December. And now the next step of that is the arrival just on Thursday of the catalog, which is available at the front desk of the Art Museum. Meanwhile, Pewabic and Anders Ruhwald were thinking about an exhibition, which I will shorten the title to, This is the Living Vessel, that was exploring the vessel tradition at Cranbrook. And as the mission of the center here at Cranbrook is to really make connections between the various components of Cranbrook and to take those connections and push them out into the region and the world, we decided a really great program would be one that would explore the history of ceramics here at Cranbrook, but then also present it in a contemporary context as well. So the way that we're going to structure today is that we're going to start with the history of Pewabic and Mary Chase Perry Stratton and her remarkable contributions to the vessel tradition. Presenting that talk is going to be Stefanie Dlugosz-Acton, who is the Collections Fellow for the Center for Collections and Research. This is her second year at Cranbrook, and she arrived at Cranbrook just a few days after the McNeely collection arrived and has really spent the last year and a half working almost exclusively on curating that collection and developing the catalog. That is going to be followed by that really extraordinary figure in the history of 20th century ceramics, and a figure that I think is a bit unsung. That is Maija Grotell, who I think many people describe as creating a bridge between the work that people like Mary Chase Perry Stratton were doing, which was still very grounded in the functional vessel tradition, and what would come after her, which is really ceramics that pushed into an even more sculptural realm. Presenting that talk is going to be Shelley Selim, who has been at Cranbrook now for about 2.5 years, most recently as the Jean and Ralph Graham Assistant Curator at the Art Museum. When Shelley arrived, though, and I remember her interview very well, she expressed an interest, if not a passion, in all things Scandinavian and Finnish, and of course, arriving at a place like Cranbrook is a place where those interests can really blossom. And so her interest in Maija Grotell really grew out of those scholarly pursuits. That is going to be then followed by Anders Ruhwald, who I think all of you know is the head of the ceramics department at Cranbrook Academy of Art, and a person himself whose work ranges from the functional in ceramics and clay to the sculptural and everything in between, and a few things out and beyond. He is going to present a brief presentation about the exhibition that is at Pewabic Pottery that opened up at Pewabic, that opened last weekend. That includes quite a few remarkable contemporary artists, but it certainly features the work of Roberto Lugo. We're going to take a very short break at that moment, and don't get afraid here. These are 10, 15-minute talks that we're talking about. So after those 3 talks, we're going to take a very short, about 5-minute break, and then come back, and Anders will introduce Roberto, and Roberto will have an opportunity to talk about his own career and work. So with that set up, I am going to invite Stefanie to the podium, and I'm going to sit down with notebook in hand and learn as much as all of you will. So welcome to Cranbrook.
Hello, thank you for coming. So I feel as though many people are pretty familiar with the ceramic vessel and tradition of kind of the objects that you saw prior to coming in to this space. And so what I really wanted to talk about was kind of Mary Chase Perry Stratton and how she got into the field of ceramics, specifically pottery, and the journey that took her there to kind of develop a pottery in Detroit as a way, as she kind of put it, to develop the resources of the United States. So this photograph I actually found yesterday and felt like I really needed to include it. It is yet to be finalized and attributed, but the Detroit Historical Society, or the Detroit Public Library, states that on the back of this photograph, which is from July 30th, 1888, the drafting room of Mason and Rice, and to the left, the figure in the front who's sitting on the drafting table is actually a young Albert Kahn, for those of you who are familiar with Detroit history. And then it states in a note that is Mary Chase Perry Stratton in the center of this group of men, which is kind of how, for me, I see her situated and her entire career situated as this kind of soul woman holding her own in a room full of men trying to start something that she didn't quite know how to do. So Mary Chase Perry Stratton was actually born in 1867 in a mining town in Hancock, Michigan, and her father was a physician and a surgeon. In 1877, tragically, her father was killed in a case of mistaken identity, and shortly thereafter, the family moved to Ann Arbor to the alma mater of her father so that they could live in Ann Arbor and her older brother could attend the University of Michigan. And it was really there that Perry Stratton was introduced into kind of the arts, and she was encouraged by her mother to take private art lessons as a child. After her older brother finished his studies at the University of Michigan, the family eventually moved to Detroit, and this is where Perry Stratton enrolled in classes in an art studio downtown in Detroit, and it was around this time that she was introduced to China painting. And this is kind of where her introduction into ceramics really started in terms of a fad. It was 19th into 20th century. It was a fad of women of a certain class, of leisure class, would kind of take classes and get together and make designs and paint them onto plates or cups or chargers. And Perry Stratton actually ended up becoming very well known in this. She enrolled in classes with Franz Bischoff, who was a Viennese-trained artist, but eventually ended her courses with him. And then she also enrolled in classes at the Art School of Cincinnati, which was later named the Cincinnati Art Academy, and studied there in between 1888 and 1890. And in addition to this formalized training, she was also afforded a greater experience as she traveled around to several other potteries in that area and also met Maria Longworth Nichols Storer, the founder of Rookwood Pottery, and other staff at Rookwood at the same time. And so kind of this apex of different artists working in the same time, different women artists thinking about starting potteries and working in that field of arts and crafts. After she completed her school at the Art Academy, Perry returned to Detroit and then traveled to Asheville, North Carolina, after a short period of time where her family had moved while she was taking classes in Cincinnati. And there she opened up her own studio and taught China painting for a while. But then in 1893, she decided to return to Detroit. And by this point, she had become quite well known, as I had mentioned. She was selling her own works, she was teaching, and then I'm going to say her name wrong, I'm sorry. Adelaide Robinot. Say it wrong every time. And her husband had started a magazine in 1889 entitled The Ceramic Studio and had asked Perry Stratton to contribute. And so these are some of her China painting designs that she contributed to the early publications at the turn of the century. And so she was really furthering and establishing her credentials as someone in the field to be looked towards as an instructor and an author and a designer. And so as a result of this, she became really interested in the kiln process. And lucky for her, when she returned to Detroit, she and her family ended up moving next door to Horace J. Calkins, who descended from a dental kiln business. So he was in the business of developing portable high-heat kilns, which he had deemed the Revelation kiln. And this was a portable kiln, as I had mentioned, but being the businessman that he was, and he was quite successful, he realized that along with Perry Stratton, they would be able to kind of open up a new venture within these kilns, not just marketing them to the dental market, but marketing them to china painters and other small ceramicists and pottery firms around the country. And so they partnered together, and Perry ended up working as a spokesperson for the kiln company. And she would travel around the nation and go to china painting clubs and to small potteries and do presentations to demonstrate the ease and efficiency of the kiln. And her job was to also then take orders. And as you can imagine, it ended up being incredibly lucrative for both of them. And also, while she was traveling through the U.S., I mean, she traveled to Portland, she traveled to New York, she traveled to South Carolina. It was extensive travel that she was doing. She also was going and meeting with other more commercial potteries to have an understanding of the tile making business and kind of the more business aspects of it so that she had a greater understanding for herself. And here is a picture of her demonstrating from a very old magazine. So not only at this time was it a success for the kilns, but also for her. She was figuring out what she wanted to do, and it was really a way for her to figure out what was next, because as lucrative as this was, she didn't particularly find it personally challenging, and kind of felt that she wanted to do something other than kind of travel and sell kilns. And so at this point, she had really felt that she had exhausted the medium of china painting and ultimately came to a point where she just was no longer interested in pursuing it. But rather than quit, she figured that there had to be a way to find a new challenge. So she shared these feelings with her business partner, Horace Calkins, and his wife, who she had also become quite close with, as Calkins' wife and Perry Stratton were actually only 2 years apart in age, so they got on quite well. She decided that she wanted to pursue ceramics in general and as a whole, and not just simply kind of the surface application of it. And how could she do that? And she thought, I want to start a pottery. And Calkins very graciously supported her financially, as well as starting by offering kilns in his basement as a way to start doing clay body samples and glaze samples. And so they started doing these experiments basically for a year, where she would go and to try and find a signature clay body, write down meticulous notes in terms of materials and ingredients and what percentages she was making. And they spent about a year on the clay body, and then after that they began going into glaze samples, which eventually is what the pottery and Mary Chase Perry Stratton became most well known for, were for her glazes. It was decided that a larger studio was needed, and so they decided to move into a new studio called a stable studio. They moved into a vacant carriage stable in downtown. And as I mentioned, they continued to do kind of trial and error efforts with glaze recipes, with resulting pieces referred to as Revelation pottery, or Miss Perry's pottery. And this vase was produced during that time period. It would have been used as a demonstration piece because at this time, although she had kind of stepped back from the Revelation kiln, she was still on and off traveling to do demonstrations as a means of income, because she was still, trying to make a living as well as start this new venture. So this piece, the kiln, as I mentioned, was specifically for high temperature glazes, so it's near porcelain, and The vase is marked with the Revelation Pottery design that you can see over here on the right, which says Revelation Pottery Detroit, and then has her maiden initials, MCP, Mary Chase Perry, underneath the little candle. And this is a really fabulous piece because there are about only 10 works known in the world in existence that bear this mark. And it's not impressed onto the clay, but stamped with kind of like a sepia ink and then overglazed. And also, for those of you who are familiar with Pewabic pottery, it is not something that you would immediately see and recognize as a Pewabic pottery piece in terms of not just shape, but particularly the glaze. It's much more reminiscent of what was in vogue at the time in terms of arts and crafts and the organic tree designs and the cobalt blue being very appealing. Perry continued her work with Calkins and the Revelation Kiln and made a point of visiting potteries, although she had to be incredibly persistent, as while she was traveling and doing demonstrations, many more commercial potteries were very against allowing a woman to come in and see their production, as they deemed it, dangerous or potentially too much of an industrial environment for her to understand or be a part of. And so she kind of met with this resistance, but said, no, I'm going to start a pottery, and I would like to know how you run your business, and had to be very coercive to get that information, because she was also interested in gathering the technical skills as well to be able to do it for herself. She also, at this time, attended summer courses in ceramics at Alfred and studied with Charles Binns. And then the new stable studio had everything that it needed, except, obviously, I feel like at this point we're gonna announce the big elephant in the room, was that Mary Chase Perry Stratton did not throw things herself. She was not a ceramicist. She never claimed to be a potter. She did very early on make very small test pieces that were maybe an inch or two high in terms of those tests for the clay body and glazes that I was mentioning, and the smaller pieces. But in terms of developing not a commercial pottery, but even an arts and crafts pottery production, she didn't want, nor did she ever intend, to be the person to throw all of the vessels. And so she felt that it was imperative for the studio to have someone who could do this. And so a part-time job was offered to a German-American named Joseph Herrick, who was trained to throw pots, and he accepted the position. And so he would work 3 hours every night after working his full-time day to throw pots that Mary Chase Perry would draw designs for. And so she would have little sketches laid out next to the wheel, and he would come in the night when she wasn't there and throw all of the pots, and then they would be drying. And then the next day, Perry would come in, or in later weeks, and do additional applied elements or surface decoration, and then she would also take care of overseeing the glazing. They began with a limited line of products that were kind of more marketable items, such as bowls, vases, and cosmetic jars. And in the bottom left-hand corner is actually, I'm sorry, it's a poor photograph. It's the only one I could find. But their first kind of commission was to make jars for the Frederick B. Stearns Company in Detroit, and it is actually a cosmetic kind of lotion jar. And I think it's very cute, but it's very odd that you would choose, when you have someone to throw objects and you haven't mastered the mold making process yet, to develop a square jar with a square lid that needs to fit and be consistent. So that was one thing that she lamented later on in her life, thinking, maybe we shouldn't have done that. But it wasn't really until their first commercial order in 1903 from Burley & Co. in Chicago that they considered developing the brand Pewabic. And Burley actually chose the name Pewabic Pottery from a list of names that Perry Stratton had compiled. And then Perry Stratton went on to exhibit Pewabic at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis. She began selling the works through Burley & Co. in Chicago, and also Peck's in Kansas City. And then later on continued to shift and develop these vessels into the iridescent glazes that you see on the right, and you can see kind of the early Pewabic mark where she was kind of marking the original works with the name Pewabic. Perry Stratton eventually went on to continue experimenting with these glazes, and is really what came to be the legacy that we now know as Pewabic pottery. And I wish I could tell you more about the glazes. I know from the specialists that we have had that many of them, particularly in the ones that are on display on the exhibit, have copper in them. But Perry Stratton was very concerned with other people stealing her glaze recipes, which was not unheard of at the time. And so there was kind of the joke that she took the glaze recipes with her to her grave. She didn't. They do still exist, but they are not something that was ever made public knowledge, and she didn't leave them to anyone at the pottery because she felt that Pewabic should continue to go on and to be innovative in its field and to continue to rise to the challenge and to make new things, which they have gone on and persevere through today and continue to make things, as well as bringing artists in like Roberto. And so this is just an early image of the pottery, and it was designed and built by her husband, William B. Stratton, which is why her name is Perry Stratton. And then just some interior photographs of the production. And if you look very, very hard in the back middle of the photograph, you can see one of the throwers. I think that's Joseph Herrick. And then to his left is Julius Albus, who started working at the pottery very young, but then ended up working and throwing pots as well and being a larger part of the process. And then earlier on in the career, in addition to kind of hearkening back to her China painting days, one of the first things that she did, although it ceased production in 1910, was to produce this kind of dining line in which she did hand paint all of the designs onto the plates and cups and mugs. But although they were, from what it seems from notes, incredibly successful in their sellability, she decided to cease production to continue experimenting in glazes. And today, if you guys go visit and check out Roberto's work and the exhibition which Anders' space is in, this is what it would have looked like in about 1912. So that's what I have.
All right, well, thank you so much. Thank you for two wonderful presentations as well. It kind of sets the platform perfectly for what I want to talk about now, which is this show here that I've curated at the Pewabic Galleries, which is up currently and opened about 2 weeks ago. Before we get going, I just wanted to thank the wonderful people at Pewabic for inviting me to come do the show, and particularly Darlene Carroll, who's really been instrumental in getting all of this show together. All I've really done is say, I'd like to have this artist come here, and she's provided for the rest of it, including having it arrive there, which hasn't been easy. So thanks so much. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to just have a chance to show some of the ceramic artists that I love, and not introduce them to the city, but at least put them together in a way that I think can kind of help unearth some of these ideas that I'm interested in tangential to my practice. So just to kind of begin, if you know, I teach at Cranbrook. I was invited to do a show at Pewabic, so obviously it seemed opportune to kind of think about the two foundational women of these institutions. And as you've just heard, they were strong-willed women that were able to kind of do what they wanted to do and make it happen in a time where perhaps the climate wasn't so, where women weren't supposed to go off and venture off in the ways that they did. And so this essentially kind of led me into thinking about some of the contents of the show here. In terms of basically two things, the sort of idea of vessel making and what does that mean relative to that of being an artist expressing oneself in the medium of a vessel. The vessel, I'm sure, as you know, is kind of, it's an archetypical form and something that perhaps ties us together as a species. It's not about where you're from, who you are, whatever you do, wherever you're from in the world, the vessel will be a familiar form. It's something that ties us together as human beings, basically. And so what better person to kind of begin to open all of this up than MC Richards. She is a potter and a poet, and was instrumental at the Black Mountain School. And basically the very kind of easy title that I've chosen for the show came from the introduction to her book that's called Centering, which is this book here, which those of you who are practicing ceramics in the 60s, I'm sure will be very familiar with, 70s too. I didn't, and it's kind of ironic that I'm here talking about this book at this point, because it was probably everything that I tried to kind of object to going through undergrad and grad school. But here I am reading this book and actually finding it speaking to me in a way that I'd never thought possible. So basically what I'm going to do is just kind of read you a bit of the text from the preface to the book, and I think that nicely kind of sets the stage for what I want to talk about here. So, I am, by calling, busy with seeing similarities between things ordinary thought to be different, grow through my limbs like a smoke tree, wafting and fusing its images, busy with the innerness of outerness, eating my life like a cake, eating life in its layers like a magic cake, made of silica sound shapes and temperatures, and all the things that appear to be separated, stacked together in transparencies of color. And it's perhaps my vocation to swallow it whole, the expanding universe, the resilient appetite, the continuous play, the changeful person, mobile and intact, finding his way on. This is the main thing. This is what I care about. It is the person. It is the living vessel, person. This is what matters. This is our universe. This is the task, the joy, and the dollar, to be born as person, to live and love as person, to dwell in the world as in a person, the living spirit, the moving form, the living word, life, death, art, life, corpus, body, being, all, persons. I took something out. Truly, life is absent in the moment when a person is eliminated. This is the urgency of my speech, for all occasions and for all human occasions, to bring man into man's consciousness. Is it the presence of person that compels my energy for life? And I'm sure of this. It's not transforming energy, but transforming person. Energy is the means. Being is not what, but whom. It is presence in whom, and before whom we show ourselves. Let's ride our lives like natural beasts, like tempests, like the bounce of a ball, or the slightest ambiguous hovering of ash, the drift of scent. Let's stick to those currents that carry us, remembering them with our souls. Our world personifies us. We know ourselves by it. Let's speak to each other in our most intimate concern. Man may be born into the world, a whole man. We are all womenfolk, male or female. Featured towards birth, we are all Mary, virgin and undelivered, to whom the announcement has been made, in whom the infant grows. As I read newspapers, talk with friends, teach my classes, I can tell that the hunt is on. I can hear everyone questing for manhood. I can hear the bellying and baying of hoofs, the trembling ground. Everywhere the mysteries of man is being searched out. Where am I? Who? So that's basically kind of the text or the introduction to this much longer book that is called Centering, which is just an amazing kind of read that basically just takes the kind of process of throwing pottery and tries to kind of think it into a greater kind of a context. And I was really struck by the text in the sense that it helps begin to kind of think about, what does it mean to actually express oneself through pottery? We often think about it as a utilitarian thing, but obviously that's not been the case for a very long time. And obviously there's always been other things going on. You just think about Greek vessels and so on and so forth. It's always been a means of expression of personal identity. And so who better to kind of start with than Howard Kotler, as you know, was a graduate of the ceramics department here in the late 60s, to begin to kind of just introduce this. This is a simple piece. What was really revolutionary about him, similar to Mary Chase Perry Stratton in the sense that he didn't throw these vessels, nor did he even, I think, make the decals. He basically just bought these porcelain plates and put the decals on, and then he started playing around with them as a kind of formal game. So this piece is simply just called Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci, and there's not much more to it. In the show, we have two other pieces in as well, which is Leonardo da Vinci by Mona Lisa and Leonardo Lisa by Mona da Vinci. And so by that, he begins to kind of complicate the idea of identity and also the idea of sort of, artistic identity, I guess, in a sense as well. Cutler often kind of using the ceramic form as a way of expressing himself and expressing his own identity in his work. Being gay, living in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s, and trying to kind of use a very traditional platform, which is ceramics, to express himself in a world that was fairly macho at that time, if you think about Volkers and so on. But really, the person that really got me kind of thinking about the show was Roberto, that we'll be talking much more about his work in a little bit, so I won't dwell on the work too much. Only to say that Roberto, I think, identifies with the act of making pottery and finding it as a way of both kind of expressing himself, but also essentially kind of a way of life. I saw a lecture of his a couple of years ago at NCCA, where I think he so beautifully kind of tied his practice of pottery making into sort of an idea of essentially living, and how pottery in a sense can also be a saving grace in one's life, which I think for many of those who work in ceramics, we often find it, everybody tells us not to do it, and yet here we go, and many of us make a good life out of it as well. Here's just an installation shot from the show, and so you can see these parts that we've included in the show here, sort of nods to, I guess, a range of muses for you, or people, you'll talk about it. I don't want to steal your thunder on all of this. But another person to kind of think about relative to this, and a kind of an update on Howard Cutler in a sense, is Jeremy Brooks, who's from Michigan himself. These pieces are called Chino ware, and so again, it's kind of a way of sort of subverting some of the ideas of ceramics, and I just kind of spoke a little bit about Peter Volkers and the kind of legacy of wood fire pottery, which often is kind of understood as being this kind of macho field, and so the Chino glaze often is kind of the thing that gets stuck into wood fire kilns, and so here he's essentially kind of made a brand of underwear that basically stuck into the kiln, and so you basically get this kind of double play on the idea of Chino. Here are the pieces installed in the show. But as a way of sort of bringing in some of the other kind of complexities relative to Grotell and Stratton, this is the work of Marie Herman, another Scandinavian that's ended up here in the Detroit area, practicing out of Pontiac, but teaching at CCS as well right now, and so also kind of a teacher and an artist at the same time. And so I wanted to, full disclosure, she's also my wife, so I have a good kind of feeling for this work, but sort of on a more serious note, the point of bringing her in is also the kind of idea of taking sort of Scandinavian modernism and the sort of idea of sort of something simple, international style, non-referential, and all that sort of stuff, and then seeing how Marie, through her practice, kind of essentially kind of emotes it. As I understand Marie's work and have been around it, it often becomes these small kind of compositions that are situated in an idea of the everyday. She often talks about how we just have pottery around in our cabinets, and how, in a sense, they create these kind of continuously developing still lives that happen around us. And so she takes from that, she takes from her Scandinavian or Danish kind of history. Both her parents were architects, and so obviously she's quite familiar with the kind of modernist tradition of Scandinavia. And so this work basically kind of takes that history and kind of brings it into this much more kind of personal space, I would say. And something where the work basically kind of pops in the subtleties. It's in the nuances of the color. It's in what you can't see with this vessel that's over there on your right-hand side. It goes in only about halfway into the pot, and then it flats out. So there is a cavity in there that's been closed over. Another favorite artist of mine, Nicole Cherubini, working out of Brooklyn in New York. These are some of her larger pieces that are in the show, Goldenrod and The Way of the White Clouds. These pots here, and often how Nicole works is that she takes kind of historical pots and then kind of dives them through her own kind of system in a way of having these kind of historical form begin to kind of reference something that is more situated within in our contemporary time. And so the sort of larger vessels that you see there, the wider vessels, not the taller ones, Mexican bean jars, traditional form that she's taken, but she's then scanned and then printed out in order to make a mold. And so it may be visible on these slides here, but you'll see some very, very, very fine lines that kind of come through all of these. You'll see the seam lines in the parts. And so she takes this kind of thrown form and regurgitates it through this digital system and then prints it again and then goes through a traditional process of casting them. And then she uses the glaze to make that pop on the surface. And so by that we have sort of a kind of a replay almost of kind of ceramic history, but also a way of kind of a notion of kind of rethinking what this history might mean to us. The white rod that you see there is a nudge to one of Josiah Wedgwood's swan pots that you can see at the Met. This is Matt Bennett Lawrence, who's a very recent graduate, and who uses the pottery form as well as a kind of a way of kind of sampling and mixing and matching and putting all kinds of stuff together. Obviously, he's kind of eating a lot from the sort of from the 50s of sort of abstract expressed kind of work where we both have this kind of reference into sort of African or oceanic pots, but at the same time it becomes this kind of wild expressive thing where he mixes and samples and puts all kinds of stuff together, some of which has reference to his own history, some of it has reference to his own life. These are not the parts that are in the show, but I think just a kind of nice way to kind of think about how his work often comes together, being these kind of face parts that at times we see the face part out, other times it's more kind of a surface that's been worked over. But very kind of lively things and things where he essentially finds himself. And then last but not least, this is the work by Kathy Botterly, who in a similar way as Marie Herman does, works in a kind of diaristic way. She spoke from this podium a couple of years ago to my students here, and when she speaks about her work, she often speaks about it as kind of small kind of snippets of her life that then come through in these various parts. And I don't know the specific history of this part here, but obviously there's some references in here that can kind of begin to get it out in the sense that, you know, some people have kind of seen this as a kind of a folded up canvas, but obviously you see a little bit of female anatomy here as well. You see kind of an idea of kind of leather bags, all these kind of things coming together. They are amazingly kind of refined pieces, and I was really thrilled to be able to get this piece into the show, because it's really when you see these work in front of you that you begin to understand the refinedness that goes into making these. She works out of a small studio in Alphabet City, I think, and just has a small kiln, not unlike Ron Nagel, but obviously with a very different kind of approach and attitude to it. It's very much about her being a female in society, thinking about her identity and thinking about her life as she goes through it, and this, I think, comes through in pretty much all her work. So this is essentially the show. This is what the whole show kind of consists of. Please don't just take the slides for having seen the show. This work only comes true when you actually see it in live. So if you haven't seen the show yet, please go down and see the show. I think it's a pretty unique opportunity to see some of this work at close hand. And so, yeah, that'll basically it. I think we're going to take a small break now, 5-minute break. So, you know, get up, move around, you know, and perhaps go out and see the Pewabic show for a little bit, and then come in 5 minutes, please. Thanks.